One of the most debated topics in the MegaTen community are theories about a multiversal timeline. Due to explicit references to a multiverse in multiple games in the series, even games with minor cameos can be seen as a small piece to the bigger MegaTen puzzle. But the question is, how? A game that's deceptively easy to talk about in this regard is the original Shin Megami Tensei. Unlike most games in this series, SMT1 is directly connected to a number of games, most relevant here being SMT2, which was released just 2 years after the original. And what makes that interesting is that we know for a fact that during the development of SMT1, aspects of the game were developed with a sequel in mind. In MegaTen Maniacs, it said that, although the specifics of how SMT2 would take shape had not yet been determined, the construction of the cathedral in SMT1 was done in anticipation of the sequel, and the cathedral was the basis for the creation of the Tokyo Millennium, as is described in the story itself. This is somewhat clear in the actual game, seeing as how SMT2 is thematically centered around the fact that it's a direct sequel. Naturally, this would make the ending of the original game very relevant to the world building of the second. So today, we're going to investigate how these two games are connected and discuss whether or not there's one intended ending for SMT1. Be warned, this will cover spoilers from SMT1, 2, and Raito 1. Now, to get to the bottom of this, the first thing we have to do is understand the premise of SMT2. In short, the game is essentially about how the law-aligned Order of Messiah took control of the city after the events of the original, building an advanced futuristic city called the Millennium, literally on top of the demolished Tokyo. However, while we know that Law eventually gained power, this is not enough to say that the main character chose it. Luckily, inside SMT2's manual, there's an official timeline that gives a brief description of events between 1990X and 2000XX. The relevant info here is found in the year 2030X, which describes the establishment of a communal cooperative society, saying, after the destruction of the cathedral, a free society and government is established, where anyone, both Messian and Gaian alike, are welcomed warmly. This text would seem to imply that the route taken in the original was neutral, since their entire goal revolved around stopping both law and chaos for the greater good of Tokyo. This is seemingly furthered by a reference to SMT2 in Raito 1 when the player talks to an NPC from the 2030s who says, "Thank goodness for the unification. My wife was a messiah, you know. We owe a lot to the schoolboy with the gadget on his arm, who defeated all the gods and demons." It would make sense that the word unification, and even specific phrasing of gods and demons here, was referring to law and chaos respectively. This implication is likewise vaguely present in SMT2 itself, with Valhalla, the game's neutral-ish area, featuring a statue for the hero, SMT1's protagonist, and its leader, Madam, being friendly with Cerberus, which was previously the hero's pet. This evidence was arguably bolstered in the GBA version of SMT2 with the inclusion of visionary items. These were unlockable cutscenes that added world building not present in the original release. In the scene Ruby Earrings, Madam mentioned having a deceased mentor who worked hard to build Valhalla and wouldn't have bent to the center's whims. There's not much information given about this character, but given the context, it could be argued that she's referring to the hero. However, I think this may be contradicted by another visionary item, titled Golden Appleseed. It features Madam befriending Cerberus after the death of the hero. If you pay attention to their conversation, their dialogue is framed as if they're not actually familiar with each other. For instance, Madam refers to the SMT1 MC formally as the hero, rather than a more personal title like Mentor. Likewise, Cerberus mentions that he vaguely remembers her from the mansion of the ruler of Valhalla, and this statement is extra damning because it implies that the hero and the ruler of Valhalla were actually separate people, invalidating the initial claim. While researching for this video, the only material I could find that directly states what ending was chosen in SMT1 was a guidebook for the Western release of Nocturne, titled Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne Official Strategy Guide, published by Double Jump. It contains a section explaining the history of the MegaTen franchise, which describes SMT2 saying, it presumes a world where the original game's protagonist took a neutral alignment and founded a utopian society whose citizens were free to follow whatever beliefs they chose. However, upon checking the Japanese version of said guide, that section was not there. This piqued my interest, so I contacted the book staff to see if I could verify this claim. Most of them responded, and props to them being willing to answer questions about a book they worked on 20 years ago. That said, being that this was 2 decades ago, they were all clear that their memory might not be totally accurate, so for future reference, if there's any issues, please give them some grace. Here's the gist of what I learned. The series history section was written by the book's credited historian, Alicia Ashby, who wrote it strictly based on her own independent research, i.e., playing SMT1 and 2 and reading fan discussions online. She also noted that she does not know whether or not that statement reflects Atlus's official stance. Further, there's no way to know if it did, because according to the book's editor, Thomas Wilde, he never received any feedback from Atlus concerning that book. So from what I can tell, there's no reason to believe the canonicity of this specific statement was co-signed by Atlus, and it is essentially just a platforming of popular fan opinion. That said, considering that this is official material, normally I wouldn't think this discrepancy was a big deal in the face of all the evidence in its favor. However, this view has a huge wrench thrown into it when you consider that this is on the assumption that neutral is the only ending that makes sense as a lead-in to SMT2. But given some new information, that's actually not the case. Recently, I found an interview from the November 1994 issue of gaming magazine Hippon Super, featuring a segment called, and I kid you not, The Truth No One Knew, with Kaneko explaining some of the backstories behind the games. Here's an excerpt from that interview. I think many people incorrectly assume that the story of 2 is the aftermath of the previous game's law route. It is certainly true that in 2, Messianism is on the rise from the start. However, the reality is, it is set up in such a way that the story will inevitably end up this way, no matter which route you take. That is to say, no matter the ending of the previous work, we made sure every conclusion leads to 2. For example, if you end up with chaos, the Gaian teachings are all over the place. The correct teaching is to do whatever they want, but this also means that there's no such thing as compassion, which naturally leads to panic. When this happens, those with more power rise up. Then what do the weak do? This is the major cause of the rise of Messianism. When you end up with law, naturally, Messianism remains, and since there are demons and revolters, power must be further solidified for the sake of suppressing these people. Neutrality eliminates both, and so we ultimately end up in the same situation as chaos. The reason why is because the original heroes did nothing. Once both Asura and Michael are taken down, that's the end of it. And ultimately, a world of chaos comes, where a small number of powerful people dominate, and the majority of the weak seek protection in the order known as law. This was the foreshadowing that led to 2. So to reiterate, SMT2 was specifically made so that every ending in the original could theoretically lead into it. Now, of course, he didn't explicitly say that neutral is not the canon route, but the fact that he does go out of his way to say that for law, and then right after explains how any ending would make sense, leads me to read this as a debunk for neutral as well. Now, to be fair, if we're being technical, there is a difference between authorial intent and canon. Just because the original team planned something in '94 doesn't mean that they didn't rethink that in future games. Besides, SMT is a living series, and it's not owned by its directors, writers, or artists. It's owned by the company, Atlus. There's always a chance of a totally new staff playing around with established concepts in order to flesh out their own perception of the series. And to be clear, there is nothing inherently wrong with that. This basically brings us back to our original question. Is there conflicting information about the timeline between SMT1 and 2? To that point, let's revisit the aforementioned quote from Raito. "Thank goodness for the unification. My wife was a messiah, you know. We owe a lot to the schoolboy with the gadget on his arm, who defeated all the gods and demons." Before, I described this saying that neutral made the most sense, and while I still think that, with Kaneko's comment in mind, I see it in a different light. To me, this statement is essentially a reiteration of the events listed in SMT2's manual. With the context that the society it's referring to could have been achieved through any ending, this statement isn't really definitive. In other words, it appears as stronger evidence than it actually is when you have already presupposed that neutral is canon. This consistent vagueness is the ultimate issue with nailing down topics like this. Atlus is almost always unclear concerning their series canon. Even in the most recent official discussion of this topic, this exact subject is seemingly actively avoided, with the book literally saying, "I cannot evaluate the ending of SMT1 from the creator's point of view." This quote is taken from MegaTen Maniac's 25th anniversary book, which is easily one of the most comprehensive books in the history of MegaTen, especially in regards to their production. So personally, I find this very telling. I kept mulling over this while writing the draft for this script until I realized I can just ask him too. So I reached out to the writer, Nobuyuki Shioda, and explained everything we've discussed so far in this video, and asked him some pretty specific questions to hear his thoughts and possibly clarify some quotes from books he's worked on. But to be clear, this will all be his personal opinion. This does not reflect the official Atlus stance, and for that matter, any of the opinions of the original staff. Think of this as an extra educated opinion. He's written many books for Atlus, and has directly handled the development documents of several games multiple times to do so. If you like any of my other videos, a good portion of them is based on his work, so I thought his input would be very interesting, and I'll be summarizing his views as best as I can. But if you're really curious, I'll link our Q&A in the description. I think the biggest thing he says in favor of neutral as the canon route is that he does think it fits the criteria of a true ending, in the sense that they're often the longest endings, and are generally more favorable or compelling. Further, in his writing, he refers to neutral as the royal road, clarifying here that he meant it as describing a more conventional route, closer to what you'd see in other non-MegaTen games. And I do think the idea of the developers actively trying to capture something with more broad appeal as an ending is worth mentioning in this discussion. However, he does seem to believe in a distinction between this idea of a true ending in the aforementioned sense and a canon ending, saying that it's only theoretically possible that 2 is a continuation of SMT1 neutral, and stated that whether it makes the most sense is a low priority. And generally, I agree. To me, it makes sense that neutral would be the preferred ending by Atlus, since they do tend to give those endings preferential treatment. But at the same time, considering Kaneko's statement, even if we say that neutral is the favorite ending and makes the most sense logically, frankly, for this discussion, it doesn't matter, because every ending is possible. In my opinion, even if we assume that the canon was updated to retcon that possibility, SMT2 should still be engaged with as a work of art on its own terms, not on Atlus's terms in 2003 or 2023. That said, I do understand that many will disagree on my perspective on canon. However, I think these ideas are worth presenting, so people don't feel compelled to view or play SMT1 in a specific way in order to enjoy SMT2. This ties into an important part of the series, that each and every player's decision is equally valid.